Morning, everyone. We're just waiting on people to come in. Just give it one more minute for people to join the webinar, and then we'll make a start. Okay, we might make a start. Good morning and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along to the webinar today. I'm going to hand over to Mary, who's going to do an acknowledgement of country.
Good morning and welcome everyone. My name's Mary Renane and I'm a proud Kamilaroi Cooma woman. I'm currently off country at the moment and I'm on Barkindji lands and currently living and working in Wilkenya. I am honoured of opening the regional webinar for you this morning for the 3 peaks, Homeless New South Wales, DV New South Wales and ACHIA, who are working together to support you throughout the Trans 3 process. I open the webinar by acknowledging and recognising the elders past and present who successfully paved the way for us living and working to eliminate domestic and family violence, and to the elders who continue to play important roles in our communities and our families in whatever capacity to bring quality and quantity of life. I also acknowledge and recognise the emerging, those of us who take on the fight to end violence for our people. 2023 NAIDOC theme is for our elders. This, I feel, is most appropriate for such a time as this, as governments today have given us the opportunity that our mothers wish they'd had long ago. Their legacy of what and how a safe place should look and feel like is within our grasps. The new refuges, safe houses, homes for people will bring more opportunities for us all to address domestic and family violence in many regions across our states. Let's all share our lived experience and work experiences to achieve for all nationalities the best outcomes. Let's all work together. As a time when no one cared is over and where we had to work in silos is gone. DV has no boundaries, and in my opinion, starts with disrespect. When you disrespect your peers, partners, family, friends, authorities, and community members, there's no limit to the dangers, to the damages that you can inflict. Domestic and family violence is everyone's business, and we are responsible for what we do as bystanders. Let's get back to respecting each other's worth. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction. Okay, so this is the New South Wales Planning System webinar, brought to you by partnership to work on core and cluster sector capacity and capability building, which is a project of Homelessness New South Wales, Domestic Violence New South Wales, and the Aboriginal Community Housing Industry Association, ACHIA, where we're working together to support the core and cluster project. Okay, I just wanted to go through a little bit of housekeeping. So questions will be handled by the Q&A functionality in Zoom. So if you've got any questions, please ask those throughout the presentations, and we'll address those as we at the end of the presentation. We'll do all questions at the end of the presentations. If you'd like to remain anonymous when you ask a question, please choose that option when you put the question up. Also want to let people know that at the end of the webinar, there'll be a survey, and we'd ask you all to complete that survey and provide your feedback. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to our first presenter, Stacey. Stacey, you okay?
Yeah. Okay. Oh. All right. I suppose I'll just introduce myself. I'm a town planner by profession. I currently work 2 days a week for Shelter New South Wales on planning related advice and affordable housing systems. I also sit on a number of regional and district planning panels on controversial DAs. And I've run a lot of training on what is called planning for non-planners, primarily with local and regional Aboriginal land councils across New South Wales. So I'm familiar with those issues related to community and have done research in the space. So this is really a session about what is planning for non-planners to some degree, except targeted more towards the needs of the core and cluster community, refuge community, and what they need. So I can't remember how to. So I just wanted to acknowledge country. I think this is a proverb that relates both to the gift from First Nations people and to the role of planning, which is we're all visitors to this time, place, just passing through. Our purpose is to observe, to learn, to grow, to love, and then return home. And I think it's a lovely metaphor about our relationship with the planet and and what is home for many people. So in terms of if you want to actually build a new dwelling, or you're looking at doing alterations to an existing dwelling, you actually need to be clear about what's possible on your land. You need to look around your block and see how the idea or the dream that you have for that site can actually fit. So I always think a good way to start is to actually talk to your council up front with information on what you're planning to do. Find out what the zoning rules are. Seek information or try and organise a pre-DA meeting. If your block is difficult to develop, or if you want to vary existing standards. So I think we've found that in dealing with a couple of these cases, the pre-DA meeting has actually been incredibly informative. You can go to the planning portal and it will tell you what the rules are for your zone. So it will, sorry, I'll go back one. So this is the planning portal. It will kind of give you a printout of what your property looks like what you can and can't do on it. It'll also tell you if your land is affected by fire, flood restrictions, whether there's it's impacted. It'll give you the name of the local Aboriginal Land Council, if that land is adjoining. So it'll give you all the relevant kind of planning information on this portal. And there's a link there if you want to go and have a look at it. You just put in your property address or your TP number and it'll give you all the information. So this is really what a zoning map kind of looks like, so people understand. This actually is in Woolloomooloo. So the pink will mean that that's residential, and it's, you know, what kind of residential, whether it's low density or high density, and we'll give you all the other kind of uses. So that's kind of the zone, and you need to know what the zone is for your land, because that will give you all the rules about permissibility. I'll just go back. Oh, it's not letting me go back, is it? Sorry. I'll just go back to this, which gives you the framework for the planning system. So there's the Environment Planning Assessment Act, and that's the upper layer. And then under that sits regional plans, metropolitan plans, and then they have the district plans in Metro Sydney, and they also provide an affordable housing target, but they will often deal with gaps in service delivery, like what kind of housing choice you need more of. You've also got state environmental planning policy housing, and that allows for a whole lot of different types of housing to be built that is not easily delivered through the planning system. There's also state environmental planning policy exempt and complying development, and that actually has a lot of developments where you just need a complying development, you don't need a development application. And then councils have to deliver local housing strategies, and the local housing strategies will also tell you exactly what the problems are in that local government area, you know, whether you don't have enough one-bedders, whether you've got, you know, a lack of housing choice in a whole lot of fields, what the issues are around housing affordability. So, and then that goes down to your LEP, so which we just discussed, and then development control plans. So DCPs, or development control plans, they're kind of the detailed planning controls, and they need to be looked at if you've got a development that you're going to go through a development application process with. So so back to so there's kind of two categories of affordable housing. in the housing set, and you get a whole lot of planning benefits associated with these. The affordability ones are the infill boarding house, supported accommodation, retention of existing affordable housing, social and affordable housing, and they get certain benefits where you can actually require affordable housing contribution and other things. The diverse housing stock is more about providing a clearer pathway for planning approval for particular types of development that they know that are in need but are hard to get. And so one of the primary ones for refuges is the group home component in that particular state environmental planning policy. And it gives you approval pathways as long as you have less than a certain amount of dwellings. So exempt developments are usually developments that don't need any approval. They're mostly complying, they have preset standards. They're often minimal alterations, like the development of a shed or a carport. Complying development is actually, that can be residential homes, group homes, but they have to meet all the complying development standards. So the lot has to be 420 square meters, or there'll be standards associated with that. Development applications are usually more complex developments. There is a merit assessment, but they require a development application. So group homes is a technical term used in the New South Wales planning instrument, and the development of a permanent group home or a traditional group home can be undertaken without consent if the development doesn't result in more than 10 bedrooms being within one or more group homes on a site. So that's actually a really good pathway, but of course there'll be restrictions. So if the site is affected by fire or floods, then it won't fit within this category, which you will find out if you've gone to your zoning link and checked your controls. So you'll immediately know whether you can use this pathway for approval. In terms of pre-lodgement, if you're going to engage an appropriate skilled professional to reduce any chance of supporting documents not meeting your development standards, it's always good. You may need an architect or a builder or a town planner, depending on your site and what you're actually proposing for the development. There's also, if you do a contract with any of these professions, there is a difference between the fixed price and cost plus contract. So sometimes it's better to go with a contract that actually has a fixed price all the way through to development approval. So you know you've got approval and that's what it's going to cost you. Then have a price with a additional, sometimes the contracts will say through to DA application or development application. And that can be a problem because you'll get a whole lot of additional costs if the development doesn't fit the controls and council refuses it, and you keep having to make amendments to the development application. So sometimes it's better to pay a bit more and actually have everything included in the contract through to approval. Commencing your development, what to take into consideration. Get yourself informed before you start. Standards, land use controls, solar access, things like passive design and prevailing winds and ventilation. Shadowing and overshadowing will be a big issue depending on the site. Understand the standards that apply to your land, such as the floor space ratio. That'll determine like what you can actually build on and the size of your block. So they're the building controls and they'll be in the development control plans usually. A bit of site analysis is important because it'll help you understand how the proposed development will kind of fit inside your site. And some of this will be informed by the case study work that you'll see today. So when you actually undertaking a DA, it'll be quite prescriptive. So it'll be a plan of the land, a level and location survey, shadow diagrams, sketch of the development, usually a statement of environmental effects. This is if you're doing a development application. You don't need all of this if you're doing complying development, such as group homes. So landscape plans, drainage plans, basics, which is about the solar and energy efficiency of the development. If the development includes variations to the current standards, so if you just meet all the planning standards, then it's pretty straightforward. But if you're actually doing one that doesn't, you may need other things like arborist, like you've got a development that needs justification, like an arborist report, you've got trees, heritage nearby, and sometimes you need a noise report. Usually not on a small development, but sometimes you will. Yeah, so that's really the core issue. The more work you do up front, the more likely you're going to be able to get your approval done easily. And you might need some professional help to get you over the line with all of that.
Okay, thanks, Stacey. If anyone has any questions, please put those in the Q&A functionality, and we'll deal with those at the end of the webinar, or after the presentations, I should say. Okay, next we're going to look at a case study, and Samantha's going to present that. So I'll hand over to Samantha now.
Thanks, Dean. Okay, so my name is Samantha Donnelly. I'm an architect by trade, and I'm currently teaching at the University of Technology in Sydney in the School of Architecture. I'm also doing a PhD on women's refuges in New South Wales, and have been involved with a company called Housing Plus in regional New South Wales that delivers a lot of social and affordable housing in the regions of New South Wales, and does some great work. Also in the area of women's refuge development. So I'm presenting on behalf of Housing Plus today, one of the case studies that they kindly provided as a good example of a regional project. So this study involves an application made by a Tier 1 provider, and it's located in central New South Wales. The aim was to develop a single vacant site with 8 self-contained units and a separate core or administration facility. The new building proposal requires a DA to be submitted to council, and I'll go through the reasons why it wasn't a complying development as we go through. So you can see the subject site needed to be large enough for 8 units, with a core building and parking also required on the same site. The land was gifted by a local developer, so the Housing Plus looked for a block of land big enough for quite a while, actually, and eventually they were contacted by a local developer who had some land at the back of a cul-de-sac arrangement adjacent to a freeway. It needed to be close to schools and community services, retail and public transport, so that the residents could easily travel. Often they don't have vehicles, or they aren't able to drive when they arrive at refuge. DA was required because of flood and fire restrictions on the site, and the tender application doesn't require a DA determination, only the details of the project. So you can apply for funding without the DA being approved already, but you need to show proof that you have that in hand. The service provider needed 8 self-contained units, and these were a mix of 1 and 2 bedders. It needed to include one accessible unit, but Housing Plus tends to make most of the units accessible with one that is completely accessible. So they have a really good kind of process of designing accessibility. The core building was to contain 3 permanent staff from a local domestic and family violence provider. It needed 17 car spaces, 2 of which were accessible. Needed to be trauma-informed design, so looking at trauma-informed practice principles that were being delivered by the service provider. Communal kitchen, laundry and living areas on top of each unit, which had a kitchen and bathroom of its own, as required by the functional design brief. Low maintenance landscape and future growth enabled. So the growth of the staff area was really important to include in the design. The core building needed to be at the front of the site to act as a kind of gateway for people arriving at the site. Independent access to accommodation. So the idea was that residents don't have to go through the core building every time they're coming and going from the site. Communal spaces for adults and children, sometimes together, sometimes alone. Children's areas are really important for different ages, not just for toddlers. Pets are a big something that needed to be considered for each unit. So having small fences to keep pets contained. And then a flexible specification. In a lot of the Housing Plus projects, they include things like a healing room, hairdressing studios in some of them, studies for teenagers and women, and also therapeutic gardens are beginning to be integrated in some of their projects. So this particular site, you can see located in orange, it's got good orientation to the north, so it was really well oriented to begin with. Access point was here at the end of the road. Site split in half to allow for future social housing development. So that was, the site was so big that it was a really good site to be able to break into 2 halves and to develop the larger part in the future. It was a flat site, which was great, but it had contaminated soil. The owner of the site agreed to remediate the soil before construction. It has a few existing trees along the riverfront, and site constraints include bushfire and flood, and a series of easements. So the flooding from the south, bushfire also from the west and the south, and easements to the east and the south, which I'll show you in a sec. So here you can see the flood, risk of bushfire. There was a sewer line which created a 13.5 metre easement to the east, which restricted construction to the east. And there's also an easement to the south created by the flood line. So it created quite a restricted site. Council acknowledged the permissibility of a group home used as a women's refuge and an ongoing community need. The communal area was also thought of as being split into 2 units or housing in the future. So it was a class 3 building. So, and the core administration was also designed so that it could be changed in the future to a 3-bedroom singular house. There's no limit with the local provider as to how many units would be allowed. So in terms of a group home, it didn't have any restrictions on it in terms of the numbers. It provided extra parking than was required. So 17 parks were provided on the site, even though the service provider pointed out that only a third of the residents who arrive have cars. So there's less parking required, but it's built for a future space. So the core building can be split into 2 3-bedroom units, as we've just discussed. And the fire service application. So the housing provider had to provide a special fire protection zone application. And if that exemption was refused, then the development needs to be moved across. So they're in a state now where they've got the application in, but they haven't received an approval yet. So they're looking at potentially moving the whole development across to the left. So here you can see the application as it's gone in and the car park on the left. This is the easement to the right. It's created by the sewer line. So if the fire protection zone isn't approved, the whole development will be shifted over to allow the 8 units to be built, and the car parking will need to be reorganised. You can see the core building here. This is what they're looking at, potentially breaking into 2 3-bedroom units in the future. And each of these units has a combination of either 1 or 2-bedroom unit setups. There's also potential, if the site needs to be moved over, to combine these into duplexes so that they're not totally freestanding. So the way that the housing provider has worked towards the development application is to create a kind of flexible arrangement so that if there are conditions, then they've got some room to move in the future. In terms of regional concerns, the need for community support is pretty out the front of any development. So garnering community support is really important, particularly if it goes to a DA. Having community support makes that whole process of approval much easier. The residential neighbourhood that it's set in has 50 and over year-old building estates, so low to moderate quality housing. So it's in quite an old suburb. Needs provision for growth, future-proof the buildings as a residential unit development. So if it isn't a women's refuge in the future, it has potential as a housing development. The site needs to be primarily safe and anonymous. So as a refuge, it needs to kind of hide in plain sight and have good security, which doesn't necessarily mean high fences, but it does mean good CCTV and staged entry processes. In terms of the council approval process, the DA was submitted as a transitional group home by the housing provider. It's considered a regionally significant project, and it needs to be determined by JRPP as it's above a $5 million project value. It also needs to have a quantity surveyor do a report to ensure that the quantities that are being reported in the beginning are kind of maintained. There's a 3 to 6 month anticipated approval timeline on this application, which it needs to be taken into account when doing the funding application, because that time is often a problem in terms of when you can spend the money that you receive from the grant. And the complying development certificate was not possible due to bushfire, flood, and using the core as an ancillary. So the core isn't deemed residential; it's deemed ancillary, and because of its scope, it needed to be a development application. Some of the design issues included orientation for thermal comfort. The housing provider is aware of the need for sustainable development in the regions. Communal spaces need to be designed for multi-purpose use, flexibility and utility. Trauma-informed design issues, so paying attention to good quality finishes, good quality lighting, and creating incredibly safe spaces. Accessibility issues, including the core and units. Parking, we've talked about, and safety for children's play areas. So making sure that the children's play spaces are located in an area which is overlooked by the core admin and the units for the children's safety. And also cultural inclusion and respect is one of the really important design issues. So making sure that there's consultation with the local Aboriginal Land Council. The pre-DA response, the housing provider sought pre-DA consultation, and council stated that there needed to be an increase in setbacks due to the special fire protection purpose for a group home. They're worried that if there's a fire and there's somebody in one of the units that can't escape on their own, there needs to be a special provision for, they needed more time to be able to escape. So that's where some of the setbacks are kind of increased because of accessibility issues. Change of layout and raise levels for some of the units to be above the flood zone, which increases the construction cost. And they also needed to provide a remediation action plan with the DA submission and an audit statement once complete. So they have additional requirements because of where the site is. They also needed to provide a bushfire consultant report with the DA. So taking those things into account is important when you're putting the budget together. And that was it for the regional case study. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Samantha. Next, we're going to hear from Amelia, who's going to talk about land councils and land dealings. And she has her colleagues, Elizabeth and Chris, who may also present. Amelia?
Hello. Can everyone see my screen now? That's looking good. So yes, my name is Amelia van Avek. I'm from Chalk and Berendt Lawyers and Consultants, and I've got my colleagues Liz and Chris also on the webinar who will be available to answer questions at the end. So Chalk and Berendt, we're a law firm based in Sydney, and we primarily act for Indigenous organisations, including local Aboriginal land councils or LALCs. And we help our clients out with lots of land rights and native title matters, but also increasingly a lot of commercial and property and planning matters to assist LALCs, especially with developing their land. And most of you will probably know this already, but local Aboriginal land councils represent some of the largest private landholders in New South Wales. So their land is going to be key to addressing housing supply issues in New South Wales, including community and social housing as well. So the purpose of this presentation is to just give an overview of some of the unique issues and challenges that LALCs face when developing and using their land. So again, quite a few of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, but for those who aren't, give a bit of a brief overview. So it was introduced by the Rand government in 1983, and it was introduced for the dual purpose of cultural and economic reparations. So it was the idea of achieving or laying the foundations for improving Aboriginal self-sufficiency and economic well-being. So it was always intended to be a means by which Aboriginal people and communities in New South Wales can improve their economic independence, as well as providing for a sort of a spiritual and social and cultural purpose for handing land back to traditional owners. So the Land Rights Act established a network of 120 local Aboriginal land councils across New South Wales. And here is a map showing all of those land councils. The red boundaries are the land council areas. And so you can see they kind of roughly correlate to some local government areas. Some LALC boundaries will overlap several local government areas, but that's sort of the scale that we're looking at. The Land Rights Act also established a couple of other key players. So we've got the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, and they play a sort of regulatory role. They provide oversight of local Aboriginal land councils, including, importantly, approving land dealings. They also provide funding to LALCs, and they play a sort of a policy law reform a role, providing advice to governments. And they can also make land claims on behalf of local Aboriginal land councils, and they do that quite a lot, especially in the last few years. You may notice sometimes if you do see that land is subject to a land claim, quite often it's the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council that has made the claim on behalf of the local government, the local Aboriginal Land Council for that area. And the other key player is the Registrar of the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, who maintains the Register of Land Claims and has some other roles, approving the rules for local Aboriginal land councils and doing some compliance, investigation monitoring and dispute resolution. So to start with, when we're dealing with local Aboriginal land council land, the ALRA ALRA being the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, places restrictions on LALCs dealing with their land, and that is defined as practically every kind of thing you can do with land. So anything that creates or passes an interest, selling, leasing, mortgaging, disposing of land, granting an easement or covenant over land, entering into a conservation agreement. So for example, under the Biodiversity Conservation Act, if you wanted to enter into a biodiversity stewardship agreement with overlap land, that also is restricted under the ALRA. Subdividing land, consolidating land, and this one surprises a lot of people, even just making or consenting to the making of a development application over land also requires approval under the ALRA. The only things that don't require approval or are sort of restricted under the ALRA in any way is a lease for a period of less than 3 years, including any option to renew, and any short-term residential tenancy agreement of less than 3 years, other than a social housing management lease. And also, smaller development applications of a very small threshold of under $500,000 total value don't require approval, and rezoning the land won't require approval under the ALRA. But everything else, we're going to have to face these 3 key sort of issues. The first is that under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, a land council cannot deal with its land unless it has done 3 things. The first is that if the land was claimed after 28 November 1994, it needs an approved determination of native title via a non-claimant application, and we'll have a further talk about that in a minute. It also needs member approval from the members of the Land Council and newswalk approval. And I'll speak about those 2 again in a bit more detail in a minute. So because of this, there are a lot of steps that you need to sort of undertake before you can even start planning some of this development. So it's important that proponents should engage early with the LAUC's executive, the CEO and the board, and should expect to be invited to present to the members on any proposed land dealing, including, for example, a community housing development. And it also means that proponents need to speak with newswalk early, because we're going to need newswalk's buy-in. They're ultimately going to approve or not approve the development. So what do we mean by an approved determination of native title? So this has come about because all land vested in a LAUC in response to claims made after the Native Title New South Wales Act came into effect are subject to native title. So as you would have seen, the Land Rights Act came into effect in the 1980s, and native title was declared by the High Court to exist in the 1990s. And so the systems had to sort of figure out a way of coexisting. And the way that New South Wales decided to do that was to make every LAUC go to the federal court and get a determination of native title before they can do anything with their land. And so this involves actual litigation. They have to go and make an application to the federal court. It can take minimum 1 year and longer if the matter is contested, if some people are claiming native title over the land. And it can be extremely costly. So effectively what a LAUC is trying to do in a non-claimant application is they're trying to seek or convince the court that either on the balance of probabilities, native title does not exist because native title is not claimed by or cannot be proved by any native title claimant, or on the balance of probabilities, native title has been extinguished over the application area by one or more prior acts of the Crown. So sometimes Indigenous people will seek to be joined as a respondent to assert native title over the application area without having filed a prior claim. And so if there's no evidence of extinguishment, this can significantly increase the cost and the time in which it takes to get this approved determination of native title. And this can cause some, as you can kind of imagine, LAUCs made up of Aboriginal members and native title holders or traditional owners. This can lead to some community disputes and division, especially where members of the LAUC are also members of the claim group, or where there's a dispute between the local community about whether native title exists over a parcel. So yes, it's an aspect of the Land Rights Act that can cause some delays and cause some disputes within the community. And now my colleague Chris Turner on the call has a wealth of experience in this area and can answer any questions you might have on it. Okay, so the next thing they've got to get before they can deal with their land is approval of their members. So this starts with they have to arrange a meeting of their members in accordance with their rule books, which involves having at least 7 days clear notice. And at the meeting, they're going to have to be able to present enough information about the proposed land dealing so that the members understand the proposal. The quorum for a LALC meeting is 10% of voting members. And for many land councils, sort of looking at member bases of a few hundred, which means that the 10% is actually quite small. And the high bar for passing a land dealing resolution of 80% means that it only takes a small number of sort of disgruntled members to derail a resolution. So this is actually quite an onerous obligation on LALCs. And sometimes, like, for example, when it comes to things like community housing, LALCs may have issues with the idea of using their land for community housing, especially if they don't get to ensure that their members, well, don't get to pick who goes into, which of their members goes into the community housing. So that's something that potentially could be contentious at a land dealing members meeting. And the last thing we need to do before using LALC land is to get the approval of the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. So they'll do a couple of things before giving their approval. The first thing they'll do is they'll make sure that the member approval was obtained properly. They'll look at the minutes from the meeting, for example. And then they will also review the land dealing to ensure that it's not contrary to the LALC's interests or to the interest of the Aboriginal people in the LALC's area. And if they approve the land dealing, they'll issue a dealing approval certificate, which can have conditions on the land dealing. And then they also subsequently, when it comes time to register the land dealing, for example, the transfer or the subdivision with the titles office, they'll also issue a second registration approval certificate that tells the land titles office that, yes, this transfer or subdivision is going ahead in accordance with all of our conditions. So where a land dealing might involve several steps. So a good example of this is where a LALC decides to transfer for various reasons, risk, avoiding the need to do multiple land dealings. They transfer the land into a special purpose corporate vehicle and then develop that land and sell it on to end users. In situations like that, Newswalk has an option to enter into what's called a land dealing approval agreement, and that can bind the LALC and third parties. So for example, a joint venture development partner. And that basically means any conditions that Newswalk has on the entirety of the development process are captured in that land dealing approval agreement that runs with the land and binds, and it can be registered on the title of the land, and it binds the LALC and any JV partner to make sure that all of Newswalk's conditions, which usually are to ensure that the land dealing occurs in the best interest of the Aboriginal people in the area, so that those conditions are complied with. And that is the end of my overview. I think we're doing questions at the end, so ignore that. But yes, any further questions, we'll deal with them then.
Okay, thanks, Amelia. We'll move on to Samantha now, or back to Samantha, who will talk about trauma-informed design.
Sorry.
No problem. We'll organise there. There we go.
Okay, so this part of the presentation, we're going to talk to you about the design issues that come up with core and cluster accommodation, specifically in the area of trauma-informed environments, and how we can design buildings that better suit the needs of women and children living in refuges, but also support the staff in delivering really quality trauma-informed care. And a lot of these ideas that I'm about to talk about aren't fixed in policy yet. So it's going to be really interesting to see how some of the refuges are built and developed, and to work out what the best trauma-informed best practice is going to look like in the near future. So the aims of trauma-informed design in terms of core and cluster are to address the good practice principles of core and cluster type building design. And some of these are set out in the functional design brief, but some of them are still being tested in practice. And also to test and deliver strategies to integrate trauma-informed design based on practices to support women and families, as we've just spoken about, and the wellbeing of staff working in the sector. We're very aware that for practitioners, there's a very high turnover rate, and vicarious trauma is a real issue that can be mediated by producing good buildings that make the staff's work more pleasant and more successful. So the good practice principles that we'll talk to you about today, there are 10 of them: safety, security, trauma-informed space, privacy and dignity, flexibility and adaptability of the space, accessibility, being a child-focused space, sustainable and operational needs, culturally inclusive spaces, and then creating a fit-for-purpose building design. And we'll go through each of those principles, and I'll give you a few examples of how architectural strategies play out in each. The aim is to provide practical, adaptable approaches to designing trauma-informed core and cluster type crisis accommodation facilities, but these principles can be adapted for each site. So the idea is that there's no one fits all solution, but that these strategies can be adapted really easily to suit different sites, different requirements according to the regional needs and different communities as well. So the first principle is safety. So in terms of safety, it's important to provide clear views of the entrance. So being able to see both as somebody coming in the entrance, but also somebody who's in the building looking towards the entrance to see who's coming in is really important. And we often talk about creating a layered entry sequence. So this starts from the landscape. So being able to slow people down before they come into the refuge by providing a gate at the front, and then possibly a security screen at the front before you get to the front door. And then as you're coming through the entry, being kind of having checkpoints built in that don't feel like surveillance as much as just good practice in terms of staging people's entry experience. It's also important to provide controlled access. So having somebody close to the front of the building is important, which is why often the core is placed right on the site boundary line to create like a gateway. Connecting indoors and outdoors is important to help people feel safe, so that they understand where they can move to if they need to move in a hurry. And having safe children's play areas, which we talked about previously. It's important for mothers to know where their children are and to know that they're safe when they're playing. Safety can also be provided by screening the refuge from the street using good landscaping strategies. Access for deliveries and services is often an issue if there's a separate delivery access point. Being able to monitor that is really important, because having strangers coming onto the site is often traumatic for people who have just left home. and clear wayfinding can be really easily integrated by using good materials and just making the building readable so that it's not complicated and difficult to find your way around. So all of those strategies help to increase somebody's perception of safety in the refuge environment. Security is different to safety. Security is more about creating a space that has security measures built in and is a way to make sure that who is on the site and who's not on the site can be monitored. So there are several strategies to do with this. So CCTV is one that most people are already aware of. And having good CCTV that's set up by a security expert is important, particularly in a refuge. A lot of women in refuge say that just seeing the CCTV screens makes them feel safer because they know that that there are cameras at the weakest points of the boundary lines. Safe parking areas are important for staff. So being able to make sure that staff can easily get from the refuge, maybe sometimes late at night, to their car is important. Also for residents, and quality exterior lighting. So when staff go home at the end of the day and residents are in the refuge on their own, it's important to be able to have good quality lighting so that residents can hang washing out or and put the bin, put rubbish in the bin, so that kind of all of those domestic duties are within a space that's well lit and secure. Duress alarms are usually provided in each unit and also in communal areas and the staff areas. So that's set up by a security expert. Quality screens and doors and windows is really important, and often it's completely overlooked. So being able to open your front door but have a security screen during the summer months is really important, so that you don't feel exposed just by opening the door to let a fresh breeze in. Quality fencing is important. Fences aren't necessarily going to keep people out, but they need to be good quality in terms of strength and monitored with CCTV and easy to maintain landscape. So the CPTED principles, the crime prevention through environmental design, states that landscape needs to be kept well in terms of making sure that the space looks cared for and looks like there's somebody living there. But we also need to make sure that it's not concealing views from the CCTV cameras or concealing views of the outside for residents. Second principle is about trauma-informed practice. Some of the strategies include reducing environmental stresses. So noise is a really big issue that most people complain about, both residents and staff. In terms of noise being a really traumatic thing, if you're in a state of trauma, noise can really trigger. Flickering lights is another thing. So having good quality lighting that's not flickering, good task lighting. Strong patterns sometimes upset people, and strong colours. Having a building that's too hot or too cold can really impede somebody's recovery. So making sure that sustainable materials and good quality heating and cooling can make somebody's recovery process much easier. Promote access to landscape. So landscape has been shown in research to give people a sense of health and well-being, and often it can kind of help somebody recalibrate their sense of place and their sense of self. And a welcoming arrival space. So the arrival sequence is really important in terms of women and children wanting to stay at a refuge. So if it's not welcoming and it feels unsafe, often that will be the point at which they turn around and go home again. So you need to really kind of focus on the sense of welcoming in a home-like space in the entry area, which is sometimes difficult when the entry area is going through a core administration building. Include a quiet space for individuals in distress. So often families are in different states of trauma, living in refuge together, and having spaces where people can retreat but not necessarily have to close themselves off is important. Providing choice and independence is also a trauma-informed principle. So giving people a choice of where to sit. They don't all have to sit together at the same table. Some of them might want to sit outside, some might not want to sit at all. Often people want to sit on the floor to eat their meals if they're coming from particular cultural backgrounds. And then having non-institutional finishes. So colours and materials can sometimes trigger people if they've spent a long time in hospital or in institutions that have made them feel really stressed. So being mindful of the choices of colours and materials. So these things, there's no kind of one fix for all of them. You need to check with the service providers what they consider will be good colours and materials to use in each of their services, because sometimes they're culturally important as well. Natural light and ventilation are good for health and well-being. As I've just said, co-designing with the service provider throughout not just the design process, but also the construction process and afterwards to check in with them as a designer is important, and it's often not factored into the cost of the design. And good acoustic control. If there's one thing that you can help refuges with, it's good acoustic control, so that staff feel like they can work in a quiet space, but residents can also feel safe, that they're not having to monitor their activities because of acoustics all the time. Privacy and dignity are important, and they're difficult to kind of frame in terms of strategies, but some spaces are more dignified than others. Acoustic privacy is one of the really big key dignity factors. So being able to create a space that's quiet often also makes it feel calm and dignified as well. Being able to open and close doors as you need is part of giving people a sense of agency. So they might want to be able to close a window so that they don't have to listen to children playing outside, so they can focus on something. Providing choice in communal spaces is important. So in meeting spaces, not just having the regular conference table with 10 chairs, sometimes having an area where you can sit in an armchair and not sit at the table but still be in the room is inclusive and respectful for people who don't necessarily need to be sitting in the middle of the space. Communal rooms for meetings and group activities can sometimes also happen outside. They don't always have to be in an enclosed room. So good landscape design goes a long way. Views to landscape create a sense of dignity, provide privacy for families without making them feel excluded or isolated. So giving them good sense of connection to communal spaces and giving them a sense of choice. And then consider accessibility and inclusion in furniture, lighting and finishes. So people need to have a range of seating options and a range of lighting options to suit their personal needs according to how there needs to be set up, the space needs to be accessible. Flexibility and adaptability is often really varied from site to site. So some families come in with 1 or 2 children, and other families might come in with 6 or 7, or sometimes other family members as well. So particularly in refuges, in remote areas, sometimes aunties and grandmothers come along with the family as well, because they're an integrated part of the family unit. So we need to provide units that adapt to variations and also adapt to levels of risk. So some families might be incredibly high risk. Some families need a place to stay for a while, but they're not considered high risk by the service provider. Interconnecting rooms are easily designed into a new refuge. So we speak about dual key access and being able to create a larger space out of 2 independent spaces, and then breakout spaces in communal areas, which I've already talked about, can easily be part of the design phase. Good storage options is super important for families and creates a sense of being at home, but also gives a sense of order and calm to a space if you provide each of the units and the staff spaces with good storage. Sleeping area layouts also need to be organised to suit needs. There's assumptions in the functional design brief about mothers and children sleeping in different spaces, but when you talk to mothers and children, often they want to sleep in the same room. So it's really key to ask the service providers what they understand their user needs to be in their bedroom areas. And dining rooms also need to be flexible for large and small families to eat together, because the dining process is part of regulating the families and giving them a sense of kind of normality as well. Accessibility is a really key issue in a lot of the refuges. And it's not just about wheelchair users, it's also about people with access needs in terms of guide dogs and pets. So seating needs to, if we think about the units seat and the staff areas, seating needs to be addressed to suit diverse needs. So not everybody wants to sit in an office chair. Consider thresholds, doors and bench height. So having flexible benches in kitchens is really easy to do in the beginning of the project. And you can provide kitchens with varying bench heights to suit different kinds of users. Easy to use controls for lighting, AC and equipment. Each of the units should be provided with a really easy to use guide that shows residents how to use their spaces. And then kitchens, bathrooms, living rooms and offices should be considered, as well as the landscape. The gardens need to be safe and healthy for companion animals. So having a little fence around to make sure that animals are kept in. In one of the refuges that Housing Plus did, the fences weren't high enough. They purposely put in low fencing so that residents could talk to each other, but then found that dogs were able to jump over the fences. So you need to ask the service providers what they need. Clear wayfinding is really important, and it can be easily managed with colours and surfaces. And basically, to integrate universal design principles throughout the refuge is a really simple way to make sure that the spaces are accessible to everybody. And of course, good internet connection is really important. Child-focused spaces, so safe, independent and age-focused indoor and outdoor areas are important. So thinking about teenagers and how their needs are really different to toddlers and newborns. Include opportunities for mother-child interaction. Some of the refuge providers have spoken about the really strong need to have good spaces where mothers and children can just kind of hang out and be with each other, not in their unit. Clear view lines we've talked about in terms of giving mothers a sense of knowing where their children are and vice versa, children seeing where their mums are. So sometimes mums need to have a consultation with a counsellor, and how to manage where the children are is a really tricky thing within refuges. So children are sometimes playing in the room, but sometimes they can play next door and still be seen if you set up the view lines well. And flexible furniture for diverse activities is important. So children like to kind of take ownership of space and move furniture around. In counselling areas, some of them have integrated children's spaces, so making that look like it's purpose-built and not just accidental. Creates more safety and more sense of order. Teen room for retreat, study and games. So having a homework space is kind of important for kids who are at school, and particularly for Year 12 students who might be in refuge for several months. Storage for prams, change tables and baths seems to be a really overlooked storage unit, which is really important. And then if possible, having a room where children can be looked after while their mothers have interviews or go to job interviews and things like that. So having a space that's just for children and carers. Next one is looking at sustainable and operational principles in terms of the core and the unit facilities. So maximising daylight and natural ventilation can significantly decrease the need for heating and cooling. And I think this is really important for the service providers who tend to spend a lot of their finances on heating and cooling their staff and residential spaces. Locating trees to create good shade in the garden, but also to create shading for the buildings is really easily done if it's designed well. Providing instructions on how to operate doors and windows for good thermal control. So it's not obvious to lots of people that having windows in different areas of the building can create a really good cross ventilation. So just being able to tell people about opening windows at different times of the day to make the space feel much cooler and to let the heat out at night is a really easy thing to do, but often overlooked. And then using sustainable materials so that there's less maintenance load on the service providers. So things like not having to paint or having materials that don't need to be replaced every few years will significantly reduce the workload on staff in managing the building. Maximize adaptable reuse options. So if there is an existing building on site, carefully designing that into the new refuge space is a good thing to do. Consulting the service provider about the needs of the space can also significantly reduce the amount of building that needs to go on or make it much more tailored to their needs. And then creating sustainable garden spaces that are connected to the indoors to be able to use the to create outdoor rooms that are an extension of the indoor means that people tend to kind of use a much more expanded space and there's less opportunity for conflict or trauma. Culturally inclusive spaces are important to consider. So consulting with First Nations people throughout the design, development and construction phases is really key. Consulting with a service provider about the different cultural needs of their users and their staff. This often includes religious and spiritual needs. So some refuges have prayer rooms built into them. Some refuges are really cognizant of needing to think about Ramadan and spaces for cultural practices. And staff areas should also reflect cultural respect because there are often staff of different cultures on the team. Culturally inclusive entry. So entries, again, that sense of being welcome and feeling safe is a cultural thing. So making sure that the entry is a culturally safe experience is important. Having adaptable communal areas for different types of groups and inclusive artworks and landscapes. So the artwork in a refuge is often the thing that kind of creates a sense of being home-like or being kind of culturally inclusive. So artwork can go a long way to making a space feel really welcoming. Site-specific. So think about the attributes of each site and how to create a refuge that kind of includes the sense of the landscape and the country that it's on. And finally, to think about fit for purpose spaces, collaborate with the service provider throughout the design and the construction phase. A lot of things can change quite radically between the design and construction. So even though there might be a design approved, during the construction phase, there's a lot of decisions that still need to be made, and including the service provider can make sure that the building is fit for purpose at the end. Staff areas need to be tailored to meet needs as a priority, not just giving staff a regular office building, making sure that they have spaces where they can relax, make lunch and not have to deal with work. Seems to be really overlooked in most of the refuges that I visited. Considering anonymity, so thinking about how the refuge fits into the streetscape is often a difficult thing to do in terms of creating a space that's big enough but also fits the scale of the other buildings. Material selections, again, looking at the streetscape and working out how to make sure that the materials are respectful of their surroundings. Meeting passive and sustainable design is a really important goal for designers, but also for services moving now into the future. And designing to allow for growth in the staff area and future-proofing all of the buildings is easy to do if you think about what the staff needs are and build on that. And then lastly, consider the Livable Housing Australia guidelines, which give really practical advice into how to make incredibly livable housing and office spaces. And again, I can put those references into the chat after this. Thank you.
Thanks, Samantha. So we'll move to questions now. There's a couple of questions in the question and answer functionality. So if you've got a question, please add that in now. There's also a question in the chat, but people can add their questions to the question and answer section. That would be very helpful. So the first question, are councils required to give notice / advertise for refuge housing when the location needs to remain discreet? Stacey, do you want to address that?
Or under the Environment Planning Assessment Act, it's compulsory for them to give public notification on any development application. So yes, they would. It would definitely go into their council report. Unless if it's complying development, then there's no public notification. But if it's a development application, yes, there would be. But very unlikely for anyone to actually look for the address in the council records, but it actually does mean that the elected representatives who would see that development application come through the council agenda would know the address. So it's really a yes. And I mean, it's probably not very satisfactory, but that's where the meeting the requirements of the Environment Planning Assessment Act to, public notification on developments is in conflict with the needs of the community refuge.
Thanks, Stacey. Okay, the next question. Is there a deadline council must stick to approve these styles of projects? I note the 3 to 6 month time frame. I think that Stacey mentioned. Maybe Samantha mentioned. But I've waited 4 months for a project to be allocated in one New South Wales Shire, let alone being completed. Just wondering if there is a limit for social housing applications that might not apply to other applications.
There is a time limit for development approval on all developments, but they do have functions for stopping the clock. So say they came back and asked for additional information. So I'm not familiar with your development, so I can't completely answer the question. But say you put in a development application and they then required a flood study. Well, at that point, there would be a stop the clock, and that would actually add to the length of time that they can do approval. A lot of developments aren't approved within the time frame. Some of them are like 360 days, depending on the size of the development. But so I'm not sure if that completely answers the question, but yeah, there are time restrictions. I think it's fine to go back to them and ask, like, what's happening with the time delays. What you'll also find is if it's a regional council, like Warriner has one town planner, Dubbo doesn't have a lot. Like there is, there's actually quite a lot of staff shortages in these little regional towns if they're quite isolated. So I don't understand the location, and I'm not familiar with whether you've been asked for additional information, but yes, there is a time restriction.
Samantha, did you want to add anything?
No, I agree with Stacey. I've heard of really long delays, but I think the problem is the funding. It's not so much the delay in council, which sometimes you don't have any management over, but it's the funding window where you're meant to spend the money within a 12-month period. That gets quite stressful for a lot of service providers.
Okay, thank you. So the next question, which was in the chat, does the local LEP need to permit group homes in the zoning, even if they are going under the housing SEP? Stacey?
Mute. The issue is that the SEP overrides any LEP control. So the SEP will always override, but it doesn't mean you should completely ignore lakes. I noticed with Narrabri, they have a complying development, DCP, development control plan. So if your local council actually has something like that, it's probably worth referring to it and trying to address any standards or concerns they might have. I must admit, there were a lot of group home approvals in Narrabri, so they were clearly quite open to that kind of development. So the SEP will override no matter what. But you should also, I've got a development at the moment, it's recreational land, it's a golf course, and so it's a non-permissible use on some land. But the issue is that the developer also didn't meet council's standards. So they didn't meet the setback and the rest of it. So they've given it a refusal, and there's a whole lot of argy-bargy going on. So it's still always, even if there's these kind of complexities, it's always important to still meet the standards. And then you know that it's much easier to get your development through.
Thanks, Stacey. Next question. What did the community consultation look like for the core and cluster? I think this is the one in the case study. Given the sensitivity that surrounded location and service provision of a refuge, were confidentiality deeds used?
The orange core and cluster wasn't the case study, but it was done by Housing Plus. So Housing Plus, the orchard was, they had really good community support in the lead up to the DA being approved. And that's part of their push, is to make sure that their projects are supported by community, because it's always much easier to get things built when you have the backing of the locals. But when it went through the DA process, I understand that there was a lot of pushback about things like access points. So the residents didn't want the driveway to be within the suburb. They wanted the driveway to be out onto the freeway. So there's a lot of arguments, and that stalled the whole DA process in terms of, how many car parks were provided, because the locals didn't want people parking on their street. So in that sense, it's obvious that people knew where the site was. And I think because they had to advertise, it meant that the refuge was no longer anonymous. But I think it was only to the core group of residents in that area that they had the consultation with. But I'm not exactly sure, sorry, so I can't be kind of 100% sure on whether there were confidentiality deeds.
Okay, thanks, Samantha. The next question, do you have any feedback on the time frame for core and cluster tranche 3? Do you know if it's still open on 27 April? I can respond to that. As far as we know, tranche 3 is still opening on the 27th of April. That's what's still on the DCJ website, and we haven't heard anything different to that. As you may have noticed on their website, it does have the date in brackets indicative. So I guess it might change, but there's been no change that we're aware of yet. Okay, that's all the questions that are in the Q&A. Does anyone have any other questions they want to add? Okay, I've found some questions in the chat function. Question for Stacey: does that mean it is possible to use old golf course land, or not likely success for multi-unit refuge, etc.? Land is hard to come by, and people have said that community land cannot be used.
The land I'm dealing with is actually zoned recreation. The land I was dealing with is zone recreation, so it wasn't community land. I can't see why you couldn't build on community land. I've done a lot of affordable housing projects that have been on community land. So it makes it harder for the council to sell it if it is zone community land for in terms of the council's land holdings. So I don't see why you couldn't. And yes, land is hard to come by, but you could probably, I mean, it's also, you know, this thing about anonymity. And the moment you go with something that might be on community land, then you lose your anonymity because you've got to actually get access to that. So I think that's kind of an issue. The problem with the recreational land was that there's no development standards, so the developer has kind of chose to ignore them. And but there are technically development standards for the kind of development they're proposing, and they probably should have met those standards, would have made it easier. And the other one is, if you have a site that's zoned B3, do you think rezoning would take too long to be considered for tranche 2? The other way you could deal with it is Sydney City Council allows affordable housing projects in their B3s. So the council could actually amend their LEP and just allow affordable housing projects in the B3 zones. So I'm not sure where you're located and whether you're in a particular LGA, but that's another option. But yes, rezonings take a huge amount of time. They take at least a year, if not more. So just amending the LEP, minor amendment to the LEP, would be faster, but would still take a few months. Unless they already permit affordable housing in the B3 zones. It's actually a really smart initiative by Sydney City to say, okay, you can't have anything else because we want to protect our business zone, but if you want to do affordable housing, we'll let you. So it's actually one of those really good examples.
Any more questions? Okay, can people just hold on a minute? I'm just going to check something in the chat function. Okay, we've got a few people that have put up their hands to talk, I guess, to ask questions. So I'm going to allow those. So Andrew, did you have a question? Oh, no. Ashhan? Sorry, I'm not sure that that functionality is working. So if you want to send a question in the chat function, we can deal with it there. Looks like it might be working now. Ashan, did you have a question? No. Yeah, sorry everyone. That don't seem to be able to get that working. Gabby? So if anyone wants to talk, I give you permission, then you need to take yourself off mute to talk if you'd like to ask a question. Okay, I don't think that's working. So look, please put any questions you've got into the question and answer. So I can see some comments in here. Okay, I think we might wrap it up. Wanted to thank the presenters today who very kindly helped out with this presentation, particularly Shelter, who did a lot of the work on the presentations and preparing for this webinar, and also Samantha for the various elements that she presented, for all their help in preparing and putting together this presentation. Also wanted to let people know that staff here and on the core and cluster team, so that's staff from Homelessness New South Wales, DV New South Wales, and ACHIA, the Aboriginal Community Industry Association, are also available to help. I'm going to put contact details into the chat function now, so if you want to contact any of us, please feel free to do that. So thanks everyone for attending today, and I would ask everybody to fill out the survey that'll be made available at the end of this webinar. That'd be really helpful to have your feedback on the session today. Thanks everybody.